Hey friends, Brian Foreman with the Campbell University Center for Church and Community, and it is my pleasure to introduce you to a friend of mine. Her name is Kylie Foley. Kylie is the Rural Faith Communities Program Manager at the North Carolina State Institute for Emerging Issues, which is a program funded by the Duke Endowment. She's doing really cool stuff, as is all of the folks over at IEI. And if you don't know them, you need to look them up. And so we'll make sure to put a web link for folks to be able to find you in the show notes. So Kylie, I prepared you. I told you I'm going to ask you what's good. So tell me what's good in your world.
Yeah, just like everyone, when we are focusing on an emerging issue, we're always looking a few years down the road. And now no one knows what the future is going to look like, not only for North Carolina, but the United States. And so for a group that's forward thinking, future focused, how can we bring the big issues of North Carolina down to the grassroots level, down to rural faith communities, to business, to government, nonprofit. IEI is a convening organization through NC State, just really trying to bring folks together and say, if we all have the same information, if we all are on the same page about something coming up, then we can be ahead of it. Well, this is the biggest issue of our time is during the pandemic. And so if we're taking every day at the present, it's been really interesting how II immediately out of necessity and also understanding what meeting the moment means right now. We've really dove into a few issues this year. So we were ending our Reconnect series, which we've been in for a few years, focusing on different topics that North Carolinians have brought up. This fall, we were supposed to be in Greenville, like many events and many groups that were planning events about how to bring people together and work through big topics. Ours is mental health. And it turns out that in fall 2020, mental health is still a huge issue, along with other things as well. And so this fall, we've been focusing on the changing nature of higher education. I know that Campbell University, as well as our partners at Duke Divinity and across the state, from seminaries to small schools to state schools, are all trying to figure out the changing nature of higher education, what the trends look like. There's a lot of parallels to faith communities and through the very slow and also urgent changes that are happening, not just because of the pandemic, but because of these huge institutions like the rural church or universities. And we've also focused on digital inclusion, which really comes to a head when we're talking about mental health as well. They have a lot of parallels that II has considered like our niche, and really trying to evangelize and get the word out about why digital inclusion is really important in North Carolina. So we started on this train in February, really trying to bring home the language of what does it look like for North Carolina to be the first digitally inclusive state. So again, for like a lot of folks, and including our pastors, we were asking these big questions about, usually in rural areas, we're just trying to get internet to a church, to a home. Those are usually the biggest challenges. And digital inclusion takes it one step further. It's not just do people have access to internet, because actually, if you look at the data in North Carolina, we have a pretty high percentage rate of people that technically should have access. Now, that doesn't mean it's fast, it doesn't mean it's reliable, and it doesn't mean it's affordable. And so taking that one step further, it's not just having access, but who's actually adopting it. So for instance, I live in Durham. We have tons of providers, take your pick. Practically where you live, we have 100% coverage. So every single person in Durham County, North Carolina should have access to internet. But our adoption levels are in the 70s or 80s, I believe. And if we go down further, we see a huge disproportionate number of people of color, lower income folks, non-English speaking folks that don't have access to the internet. And then you put the pandemic on top of it, and how we're getting our health news about testing numbers, how we're connecting to our schools online, how we're doing telehealth visits, how people are working from home. It's an equity issue through and through. And so in a virtual world, digital equity, digital inclusion means more than anything. So we were grateful on one hand that II has been working on this since late 2019, figuring out how do we bring the language of digital inclusion to the forefront even more in North Carolina. Our role is how do we get faith leaders to be the champion for this? It's not an immediate connection that the deep spiritual work of a faith leader should also be digital adoption and inclusion, especially with there's so many thoughts about like what the internet is, how it's good, how it's damaging folks. But in February, we brought the question to a group of faith leaders: is access to high-speed broadband a human right? In the same way that maybe access to water, education, and we just had a really good talk about what modern life looks like. with access to broadband. And then in March, that was, mid-February, March 2020, everything changed. And so it's been really cool to work with faith communities that practically are responding, putting hotspots in their Wi-Fi parking lot because they know kids need to come and access Wi-Fi spots. The Rural Center and others have been great, giving grants to faith leaders to actually have computers and in their space and their fellowship halls for people to safely come and access services. Because again, that's some of the only ways that people can stay healthy, can be okay, can continue to make money, to get information, connect with family and friends when we can't go down the street and be in each other's homes. And at the same time, it's leading to a bunch of questions from faith leaders. What does connection look like? So II is talking about digital inclusion being really important, and it's an equity issue. There's millions of people that are disconnected because of the color of their skin, how much money they make, what language they speak, where they live. But we also know that there's senior citizens in many of our congregations that aren't identifying and do not like going to Zoom worship, that feel isolated. And I have felt this before. And so when we're taking away connections because of the pandemic, yes, internet connection and digital inclusion is really important to make sure all students have access to school, that all workers have the ability to stay safe and to connect to income, that even if you don't have a rural hospital close by, that you can talk to a doctor online and feel safe and okay. But it's really a connection issue. If we can't go down the street and talk to folks, if Sunday services go from being in person to the next week because cases are rising, being on Zoom again, not, talking to each other with masks, not singing in services, there's so much grief and tragedy, like trauma, that has happened with that. But being able to dig in deeper and to have faith leaders really take on the role of, again, like I mentioned, digital inclusion plus mental health, of understanding that this connection issue, there's some practical ways to do it. Again, it might be a Wi-Fi hotspot in your parking lot, saying we think it's really important that people have a way to get connected. But we also know our faith leaders are really asking this deeper question, have had just the most beautiful, intense, and real conversations with faith leaders that are really taking that question of what connection looks like, not only in 2020, but for changing rural communities, changing faith communities. And then they are the leaders in this space. They are the ones asking their county managers not only about a digital inclusion plan, but they're asking about further mental health resources and saying this is something that we need to step up. Seeing, again, those faith leaders rise to the challenge in ways that many of them have been community leaders before, but are using their goals, their position, the relationships they have to really advocate for people working together even more so during a pandemic with limited funding, limited capacity. I just have never been more humbled and impressed to work with faith leaders than this year and the last 8 months.
Yeah, and I think what's really cool, so much of what you just said was cool. So let me verbally process for a minute with you. Yeah. I think what's really remarkable is y'all are using the language not just of inclusion but also equity, and that transcends race, ethnicity, age, whatever the case may be, because so often we get caught up, particularly if we have access to the internet and it's super easy and we don't think about why it's so important. But I mean, just as you were talking, you hit on three different examples just sprung into my mind from personal examples, right? So, if somebody's concerned about how is this an equity issue, think about children with school and their access to be able to do their lessons, to access their teachers. It's hard enough for students to feel like they're succeeding with online education. Now imagine if they're doing it with a dial-up modem or having to go to the public library, or, as wonderful as it is for churches to be providing hotspots, having to go in their car somewhere just to get internet access, things that we take for granted. That's an equity issue. I think about my mother. She's 80. She would love to get a COVID test, not because she thinks she's exposed, but if she were to want to travel somewhere for Christmas or Thanksgiving or whatever the case may be. And she said, I don't know where to go. And I said, well, you can sign up for an appointment online with the health department in Wake or Harnett County or wherever you may be. And she says, how do I do that? It's like, oh, that's right. That's right. I'm making an assumption that you have the same technology experience that I do. And then the third one that jumped into my brain was thinking about people looking for jobs. And we always say, oh, there are library computers you can go and use and so on and so forth. But those computers have a 30-minute time limit and they don't save your application. So somebody could be halfway through a job application and their 30-minute time limit goes away, as does all the work they put into their application. So digital inclusion is an equity issue. It's a justice issue. It's really important. That just blows me away, all the good work that you guys are doing in that area, and to help faith leaders understand it as more than just an infrastructure issue.
Absolutely.
This is the health of your community that's at stake. So what are some things they can do right off the bat? If somebody's watching this today, what are 3 things that they can turn around and go do today that would make a difference?
Yeah. For some folks, we've encouraged pastors just to they probably already know. Or if folks are calling you on the phone, those are the talkers. Or like, hey, can you come sit in my driveway and talk? So you might know your folks and how they perform are coming on. But we've also heard that Zoom attendance is dropping or virtual service numbers are dropping, and it's pretty demoralizing for folks that are in the grind of doing online services and not quite sure why people are connecting. I'm sure there's a lot of spiritual, emotional, just life reasons why that's happening this far in. But people might have different reasons why they're tuning in and tuning out now versus March or April. So doing that kind of, lack of better terms, audit with your own congregation members about how they're connecting with folks. Like, are they talking to their friends and family? You can just ask if that's in person, which there's safety concerns or some other things as well, but phone, texting, email. We're definitely the case of your mom is not a small example. I think it's unheard of for people like me that grew up with the internet to think that's oh, that's just 1 or 2 folks that don't know how, don't know the reason why. And it's because we have this story in our head that the internet is accessible, everyone knows how to use it, or that it's also a luxury. It's for Netflix, it's for streaming. And so we don't put the same infrastructure and funding behind it to make sure it is actually in people's hands. If you think about it, digital literacy, which is a part of digital inclusion, is saying not only do you have the right device to access what you need, but you know how to use it. Well, before, you'd have to actually be with someone in person to teach them to turn on a computer. So walking your mom through how to even embrace new technology, which often leaves most of us when we don't know how to switch, the HDMI cord on the TV. You ask someone else to do it, we get flustered. It brings up a lot of emotional stuff when you don't feel like you know how to connect and you feel dumb, or it's too expensive or outdated and you just don't know what to do. So there's some real concerns that faith leaders don't have to be tech experts for, but can really hold that space of how are you connecting? Digital inclusion and making sure that people can connect virtually when that's often the only type of services that many groups are providing is a really good, important component of that. A lot of faith leaders also don't know that we have a public broadband office in North Carolina, which is incredible. Not the states have so many dedicated resources. There's a public Wi-Fi hotspot map. It's incredible. So many Baptist churches, so many great churches across North Carolina are offering up their space for free and safe Wi-Fi. And like you said, Brian, I think it's really important. It's a really great first stop. It's also really hard to think that if that's your only Wi-Fi access spot in winter, if there's not access to restrooms, if you have to rely on an adult to drive you and sit in a parking lot for 3 or 4 hours, I think the total conundrum of digital inclusion can be held more by faith leaders than by tech experts saying this is the way, let's put hotspots in every area. North Carolina recently dedicated $40 million of funding in September, 30 million to get hotspots into students' homes and across accessible places in North Carolina, and $2 million to help train teachers and different folks to help with families to connect easier. But it does take a toll on folks. So having those faith leaders that can code switch is really important. In order to do that, we want faith leaders to take a look at the map. Where are the public Wi-Fi hotspots around you? If they don't exist, can that actually be something your faith community can do? You can contact your local council of government, IEI. We can help figure out what does that look like for you to be a digital connector during this time. And we also realize a lot of churches, faith communities don't have internet themselves, so that might not be the name of the game. Something else I really want to recommend, not only checking out the public Wi-Fi map, but IEI has been at the forefront of funding digital inclusion projects. So not just the hotspots, and not infrastructure, which Google, the state, our folks are funding. It's a really expensive project. But how do we make sure that people that are getting left behind or digitally excluded are being brought in, and that counties are thinking of it as an equity issue? And so we've given out over 36 grants to counties across North Carolina through our Band and C project with the North Carolina Public Broadband Office. And many faith leaders were the ones that started those applications, that contacted their county manager, their city, county governments, their libraries, and said, hey, we need to get a group together and figure out how to get devices to this group of senior citizens to make sure that the last stopgap measures of our students that don't have access to Wi-Fi have the same access as everyone else in their schools. And so, it's not all counties, but 36, you can go on II's website and we'll make sure to include that and see who in your county is doing what with what project. They're countywide. There's someone you can connect to. We're not asking for faith leaders to take on the task of bringing internet to their counties, but using their influence and their voices to really say this is an equity issue, and we care that people have the same access to resources, whether that's going to a Sunday service online or trying to find where a COVID test is. We're leaving out people that have always been excluded, again, because of systemic racism, because of where they live, especially deeply rural areas where it's hard to get access. There's just a lot of folks that have been left behind that are continuing to get left behind during the pandemic. And churches can be that voice as well. And the last thing I'll add is it's just really important to figure out, to have that conversation about like a winter plan. So it's been really incredible. Maybe my favorite group of faith leaders in May started talking to me about, we really care about kids. They had a tutoring program in schools, really working on third grade literacy out in the mountains. And then all of a sudden, those programs in school had to stop because of virtual school. And so it was really hard for a group of older folks that are in higher risk categories to figure out, how do we meaningfully show up for kids through reading when we can't gather in person? And there's safety concerns for gathering online. Trying to protect kids and families is also really important. And they were immediately thinking, okay, we might not be able to solve this issue right now. We're in virtual school. But what we know coming up in the mountains is that we're gonna have winter. And so this summer, maybe we can gather outside, we can, find different ways to adapt and to be together, whether that's eating together, just physically being together and connecting. And then when it gets really cold, and it's also flu season, and if cases starting to rise, now mind you, this is in May, and this is faith leaders being, they're the emerging issues talking to me, saying like, we need to start preparing for that now. And that they're able to say, we can't solve this immediate crisis with the virtual school and mentoring, but we need to start thinking through how to be there for families when things are getting tougher. And so they started thinking through safety protocols. How do we bring more more community spaces on board so we can spread folks out? If they're not able to get access in their homes, students could go to 15 different locations and spread out to do school online, as opposed to having more kids in one location. What does it look like to have fun during winter when you can't go outside all the time and you're on the computer all day? Just really holistic stuff where they weren't doomsday prepping and thinking winter's coming, but they knew it was coming, and they cared so deeply, and they knew their capability and capacity and the limitations that they had, that they were able to drive that conversation in May. And I just thought that was beautiful, when we were all in crisis, urgent panic mode, that faith leaders were the ones that could create that space of visioning, of slowing down, of thinking practically, how do we like step into this space and hold more than just like being a location for things, but like we can be the thought leaders of this space. That story has been repeated all over North Carolina. So something like digital inclusion becomes deeply spiritual. Even at the forefront, it just seems like, how do we put a hotspot in a parking lot?
Right. Yeah, sacred space making or sacred place making is far bigger than just the Sunday morning sanctuary.
Absolutely.
You're creating it in all these ways. I think what's cool, and I hope that the clergy will take advantage of so many of the resources that you've mentioned and bring them to their communities. But I also hope that they heard all of the different ways that clergy impact their communities. You talked about education. You talked about public policy. You mentioned public health. You talked about communications. What else was in there? There's healthcare, not just public health, but healthcare as well. And then just mental health and loneliness. I mean, you talk about all these different ways that clergy can have an impact on their community. And so sometimes clergy may feel like, how much of a difference do I really make? Or how much of a difference am I making while all of this stuff is shut down and I can't even visit with my folks? The answer is you can make a huge difference. It just looks a little bit different. But at the end of the day, all of this is kingdom building work. And so, so I encourage them to reach out to you all at IEI. Get on their newsletter.
Yes.
Learn about the good work that IEI is doing. We will make sure to link to them again in our newsletter. I think we've ran Band NC a couple weeks in our newsletter as well. We want people to know about the good work that you're doing, because you guys are challenging rural faith communities. I think it was you that used the term to be anchor institutions in their communities, and they certainly should be functioning that way, and many are. And so, so thank you for the leadership you're giving there.
Oh, thank you, Brian. Yeah, I mean, the weird thing is, and this is not a total experience, a lot of faith communities are really struggling right now. Some are figuring out, do they survive this time? They might have sped up a timeline financially, spiritually, emotionally, community-wise, what this looks like. And at the same time, we've had other faith communities really dive in deeper and figure out, you know, it can't be said enough. The phrase everyone would repeat before is, church is outside the four walls, or our faith is outside the four walls. And it actually is this time. And with not a lot of change in the immediate future. And so the faith communities that have really adapted their current ministries, knowing what they care about and figuring out, oh, how do we respond, have done so in creative and beautiful and like made more partnerships, made more friends, met more needs, met more people. And it just looks different. And the folks that are able to hold that space, generally, I would say, feel less burnout. They're able to focus a bit more. They're able to understand this is an impossible situation. So moving forward together and not being alone and being honest about it is the only way to do that. And then when we have some of that space available where we can breathe, then is when we can think about things like digital inclusion. Like how can we even imagine adding things to pastors' plates during this time? And the question is, like, disconnection is already happening. And in fact, that's why many people get into ministry, is they want to be an active solve and healing agent for folks that they know and love through their spiritual practices and through their beliefs and their community, to be that healing agent. Virtual is just practically one of the ways that we less confusing, less emotionally taxing, is one of the ways that faith leaders can feel more connected during this time, and hopefully less alone.
Yeah. Kylie, that is not just what's good. That is great stuff that you've shared with us today. And I'm really, really grateful for that and for your time. So many prayers and blessings as you all continue your work.
Thanks, Brian. This was great. You're right. Things are going well. I forget that easily. So this is a great reminder.
Yeah. So let that be a reminder to all of you. You're doing good work out there. Remember that.
Absolutely.
Take care.